Hello, it's Jeremy Faust, editor-in-chief of MedPage Today. Today, we're joined by Dr. Robert Califf. Dr. Califf is a cardiologist and a member of the National Academy of Medicine, and this is his second stint as the commissioner of the FDA. Dr. Califf, thanks so much for joining us today.
Hey, good to be here.
Let's jump right in on what's top of mind for so many readers and viewers, which is spring boosters for COVID-19. The immune compromised, I think increasingly this is the area of importance, and in older populations as well. Will the FDA reconsider a spring booster, and what would it take to trigger that kind of reassessment? You've got the UK and Canada going forward, Israel studying this very carefully. Is it too late?
Let me just make a couple of points. First, I'm glad people are interested because I've recently had several conversations with people who have been studying the history of pandemics, and there's this actual thing called amnesia that comes into play where people just don't want to hear about it or think about it when they're in, thank goodness we're in this relatively quiescent phase. But it's good that people are interested. It's not too late. We're looking at all the data coming in, and as soon as we have the evidence that we need one way or another, we'll make a decision and let people know. We're not quite at that point yet, but we're aware that people are interested. I'm 71 years old myself, and I'm 7 months out from my last updated boost. So very much on our minds here at FDA. So, it's not like we go months without looking at anything. It's really for people that work in the Center for Biologics. There's a group that is looking at this every day, and across the administration, of course, Dr. Shah is always very interested in what we're doing.
How fast can these things move? We just came off this pandemic period where things were moving at a lightning pace, and during the normal times, that's not the usual pace. Here, I feel like we're sort of in between here. If it's early April right now, how quickly can the FDA come and say, we did see some new data. Let's go ahead and do every 6-month booster, or even more often for the immune compromised? May, June, like when? What kind of timeline are we talking about?
Everybody always wants to know the timeline, and I appreciate that. And I would just say it's the machine is well oiled, and when it's time to make the decision, we can make it quickly. I can't really put an exact timeline on it because we never know what new data may come in as everyone around the world is following the course of both the pandemic and of the impact of vaccination on outcomes. So far I think it's beat expectations so much more than I ever thought, with this dramatic reduction in death and hospitalization for those that are up to date. So it's quick once the decision is made, and we're constantly looking at the information.
Does the end of the public health emergency, the PHE, does that affect the lever of the EUA pathway, the emergency use authorization pathway for vaccines, for these particular vaccines?
It doesn't. Those go on separate tracks. Obviously, they're related in some ways, but we still have the authority for EUAs in place.
And what about for totally different areas with EUA? For example, like if there were to be a new treatment for long COVID that came out, and the public health emergency is over, what's the apparatus? Is it still the same apparatus, or is it a new day? It's not a PHE anymore, so back to the old way.
Well, that's an interesting question, and I think the answer to that is probably all depends. The authority is still there, but we want to be careful not to use it unless it's needed, because we got a lot of other therapeutics and other diseases that are taking a toll. I'm sure you're aware the life expectancy in the U.S. is dropping right now, not just due to COVID. So I feel like we got all the tools we need if we need to move quickly to do it. But we want to be careful in the use of that authority.
One more question about the EUA pathway. I think it's been very successful. I mean, there's no argument there. We've seen some really big wins with this pathway during the pandemic. But one thing that I think is interesting is that these are not FDA approved drugs, right? So you can't just use them off label, and academic or investigator initiated trials aren't aren't really possible, right? If Pfizer doesn't want to give you Paxlovid to study, you can't do a randomized controlled trial because you can't just go to your pharmacy and dispense the drug. Do you think that the EUA pathway can be refined in a way that can actually allow investigator-driven studies to be done more quickly in the future?
Well, I think, the reauthorization of so-called PAPA, the Pandemic Preparedness Bill, is up this year. And I think there'll be a number of fine-tuning efforts with various approaches to the pandemic, including this one. I do think, though, it is entirely possible to do trials in this situation. After all, the government, for example, with the vaccinations, bought a huge stockpile of vaccines. So it's not that you can't do the trials. It's just the mechanism is a bit different. It's Jeremy, you brought up the investigator-initiated studies. I'm all for those. I've spent 35 years in academia, but I think we'd be a lot better off if the investigators worked together and did trials that were large enough and coordinated enough to actually answer the questions. We got to, there's a phrase that was Janet Woodcock had coined in an interaction I was involved with the NIH a few years back, the SCT, the small crappy trial. What we need are there's a real place for small trials when they're well done, but we need more trials that answer the critical therapeutic questions definitively. And that is a major effort that we're thinking a lot about right now.
I mean, Stat News reported that that one of the reasons that the FDA is less interested in like interferon lambda, and this is like New England Journal study done overseas, is because it wasn't sort of an industry-funded U.S. study. Is that true?
No. We don't care who the sponsor of a study is. What we need is good data, well-designed study, and someone putting in an application who can actually manufacture the product and distribute it with the kind of quality that's needed. I think sometimes the academics forget about all the rest of what has to go into getting a drug distributed. It's not just a clinical trial result. You got to have a manufacturing facility. You got to pass inspections. You have to have a distribution mechanism. It's many, many other aspects involved in a drug application than just the clinical trial. And we have nothing against data coming from foreign countries. If the studies are well done, I personally, in my career mostly did multinational clinical trials where the U.S. was not the major enroller in most of those trials because we're only 4% of the world's 8 billion people. You wouldn't expect the U.S. to be the major enroller in global studies. So, no, I think there are a lot of myths out there, but hopefully this will clarify some of it.
That's very helpful. I'm also interested in sort of reciprocity in general. Look, I think we have our own FDA, and it probably one of the greater regulatory bodies in the world on this question. But when you look at Europe and other parts of the world where they have many, many more rapid tests for COVID, and now even one of my readers talks about, a 4-in-1 that they've got in Europe where you have both flus, RSV, COVID, all in one point of care test. Should there be like a reciprocity pathway for something like an inexpensive point of care test? I mean, that seems to me like low hanging fruit. Like, why have all this infrastructure devoted to a question that's actually sort of we're already on the 10-yard line, first and goal. Like let's
well, I think that's I really think, Jeremy, that's a little bit of misdirected thinking. I mean, if someone has developed a test and they've done the studies to demonstrate that the operating characteristics of the test, sensitivity, specificity, predictive value numbers, and hopefully even operating characteristics measured beyond that, and they've submitted it to a regulatory agency in Europe and it's been okayed, it's not a hard deal for them to come to the US and just submit their data. That's all we really are saying. You don't have to redo the studies if they've been well done and they're in a representative population and meet all the quality characteristics. I'd also say that in general in Europe, it's not that there's a whole bunch of more tests that are actually being used. In fact, I think one of the characteristics of countries that may have done a bit better with testing than we did in the US is that they focused on a smaller number of overall tests, but made sure that they were used by a much larger proportion of the population. I mean, we've ended up with a lot of tests in the US, and you're probably aware that early on when there was a period where it was perhaps too restrictive, and then a period where the gates were open, and a lot of tests turned out not to be so good and had to be reined back in. If you got good data, bring it, and we're wide open to look at it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that early on the antibody tests were really problematic. The antigen test, I think that it feels like a lot of companies applied, only a few got it. But there seems to be a big public demand for this moving forward, not just for COVID, but for flu or strep or RSV. I think. Do you think that do you see that market expanding?
I think at-home testing is going to be a huge area. And the only part of it I'm really concerned about, I mean, again, if people do good tests, develop good tests, do good studies, advertise what their operating characteristics are in a way that people can understand it, it's going to be really good. But I'm worried about equity here because you said inexpensive. To someone who's you know, in the lower half of incomes in the U.S., you know, buying a test in the drugstore is not a minor decision. And so we really got to think about how all this is going to get paid for in a way that leads to equitable availability. Because I would argue the people that are going to benefit, who should benefit from it the most, are those who are in the working class and have to go to jobs and take kids to school, not those of us who are professors. And you know, there's a great quote from The Atlantic that Ed Young wrote: technological solutions drift into society's penthouses, diseases seep into society's cracks. And so I'm not worried about the technology. I'm not worried about evaluating, having a market. I'm worried about equity when it comes to the use of this technology.